Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. So, this is Khaled, and you're listening to Pali Threads. And today I want to talk about what's happening with Syria. So, as of the time that I'm recording this video or podcast audio, wherever you're listening, Syria, the Syrian government has had its sanctions lifted by US President Donald Trump. And we've seen a lot of people celebrate this news. But today I want to talk about whether this is something to celebrate. Maybe we should question why sanctions were placed on Syria in the first place and why sanctions are getting lifted. This is the talk of today, and I want us to have a genuine conversation because I know there can be very strong emotions. And before we begin, I want to say that I'm a Palestinian Syrian, and frequently I'm getting on my page whenever I dare to speak on this subject that this topic should be left for Syrians and I should shut up. I reject that. One, because I'm Palestinian Syrian, my dad's side of the family, born and raised there, all my aunts and uncles. I have Syrian travel document for Palestinian refugees. In fact, it's the only identity I was born with. I was required to serve in the Syrian military under conscription. I did not, but I was required to, so I couldn't travel there because of that. And so also, I refuse to accept the Western colonial borders that were established in the Levant. I view Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, all as one country, Bilad al-Sham. And so, yeah, ultimately, I will speak of Syria as I speak of Palestine. And finally, when something happens in any part of the world, I will speak if there is injustice. And to add to that, what is happening in Syria directly impacts what is happening inside Palestine and to Palestinians. So these are multiple reasons that I do get to speak on this, and others should speak on this and any subject where they get to when it comes to speaking against oppression and advocating for human rights and social awareness, and to be critical thinkers. Let's go back and talk about Syria before Hafez al-Assad came to power. So Syria became independent from the French, I believe, in the 1940s. And so after that, there was coup d'etat after coup d'etat. They had no stability. And it was only until Hafez al-Assad came to power in the early 1970s that Syria saw stability. It saw a stable government form. And until then, there was a lot of division, whether it was social, political, religious. I actually read a book about Hafez al-Assad, and it's fascinating, and it talks about his upbringing and even his grandfather and father and growing up in the countryside and in the mountains, and even where the Assad name came from of being very powerful. It wasn't him, it was, I believe, his grandfather, who was seen as a very fair negotiator and who would be brought to help in negotiations. But what they experienced and his family experienced growing up was a major lack of care for Syrians living in the rural or countryside, and also a lack of care towards minorities such as the Alawite communities of the country. So Hafiz came to power, and aside from the stability, you cannot deny the major transformation and advancement of the country. I've seen people say that Syrian growth stopped when Hafiz came to power. That is such a lie. That is when the growth and of the country started, and it came to be respected by, in terms of the government, by other regional powers, and it became a regional power itself. Syria, up until the fall of Bashar al-Assad, had free education, free healthcare. In fact, the healthcare was so good, despite the sanctions and the war, that my relatives in Canada went to Syria to access healthcare that they said was better than whatever healthcare they could get here in Canada. Could you imagine? Even if you look at the life expectancy under the Assad regime, when Syria was under the Assad power, the life expectancy was similar to that of the United States. This is despite them supposedly being hindered by sanctions even before the war in Syria. Syria was listed as a state sponsor of terrorism from, I believe, the 1970s. You could even see a CBC News documentary that was done, I believe in the 80s, where a journalist went to Syria and she kept trying to show the Assad regime in a negative light. But ultimately, at the end of the video, and you can watch it, she says,
but there are no lines, no shortages, and most Syrians, even the poorest, seem to have plenty to feed their families. Syria boasts that it has no real poverty, and from all we saw, they were right.
even after Hafiz al-Assad, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, I was lucky to spend a month in Syria before the war started in 2010. And I remember it very well. It was one of the countries where I felt so safe, security-wise. Yes, you couldn't speak about the government. There was major corruption as well at the borders, so you'd sometimes have to pay guards or policemen. They would literally ask you to pay them or they wouldn't let you in or do something to you. And that part was scary. But this is also unfortunately very common throughout the Middle East. And when we continue talking about what I experienced in Syria in 2010, I was amazed. And I told everyone at the time that this is the country that I want to move to when I grow up, because I never felt such harmony between different ethnic minorities, religious minorities. The church bells would ring, the mosques, you would hear the adhan, the call to prayer. And our relatives would visit Christians on Easter and Christmas, and they would visit our Muslim relatives for Eid and in Ramadan. So it was just really beautiful to see the country in this way. When I went to Jordan in that same trip, right after, I was horrified. I actually went to the washroom and cried when we first arrived to one of our relatives' homes because I was shocked by the disparity. You go into an extremely rich area, and then right next to it, you have children begging on the street and extreme poverty, which you even see in the Gulf countries. But in Syria, I saw none of that. In a whole month in Syria, I saw none of that. And on our first day in Jordan, I saw that. And so that is what Syria was under the Assad regime. There were massacres. There was the Hama massacre, Tadmur massacre, prison massacre. There were massacres. If you dare to speak or try to protest against the government, you would be wiped off the map. No one would know where you are, who you were. But that is not unique in the Middle East. That is commonplace. And so I see a lot of people that celebrated the fall of Bashar al-Assad, who are like he's a tyrant, dictator, oppressor, all of that. But these are the same people who have pictures of other dictators in their bio of other Middle Eastern countries who are even more oppressive to anyone who dares to speak up and who do crimes to countries around them. Syria actually was a loud voice against oppression and against foreign meddling in the region. I cannot say that about most Middle Eastern countries. And Syria also was advocating for Syrians, whether it was Turkey's colonization of northern parts of Syria. This is even before Bashar or before the civil war. We could talk about the Hatay province of Turkey, which belongs to Syria.
Syria was the soul and the pride of the Arab world. Syria sees itself at the center of the Mideast. It sees itself as the heart or conscience of the Arab world, the keeper of Arab nationalism, the leader in the fight against Israel. These supporters chant, with our blood and with our soul, we will sacrifice ourselves for you, Hafiz Assad. In the 13 years since he seized power, he has achieved an indispensable role for Syria in the Mideast. Now, U.S. envoy Donald Rumsfeld comes to Syria. Saudi, Moroccan, and French mediators all come to get Assad's approval. Night and day, the limousines pull up, bringing diplomats.
The Americans tried to get them out, avoid them in Lebanon. Now they're back to Damascus. All the Americans are back to Damascus. Syria is the heart of the Arab nation. You cannot avoid Syria when you have to deal in the Middle East. Syria is at the center of Arab policy.
Also, I want to talk, when Bashar al-Assad came to power in the early 2000s, he actually opened up the country a lot, and there was a lot of boom, and there was a lot of building and construction projects throughout the country. And even in Damascus, we saw Paris, France was helping the construction of a metro system, and it was the most, I believe, that the country had ever saw tourists come to the country. It was just very open to the world. And it was also a hotspot, a region for people to go learn Arabic, for people to study and learn the culture, the arts. Syria was the spot in the Middle East for all of that. And unfortunately, a lot of people wanted to go see it go down. Now, we can talk about the Arab Spring, the revolution, the uprising, and foreign interference meddling. Do I think that Bashar al-Assad or the Syrian government handled things the right way? No. I think when there was protests, whether there's foreign interference or not, say, you know what, we're going to hold an election right now with UN observation. And I genuinely believe at the time, the way the country was doing so well, that Bashar al-Assad would have won a foreign observed election. Instead, there was a crackdown, there was a war. I do believe there was major foreign interference and arms entering, supporting certain groups in the country. Now, is this to say there was no opposition to the Syrian government? No, there has always been opposition. But I do think that grew with time as the war on opponents increased with time. And so then that continues. Eventually, we reach a point where NATO enters, and then ISIS expands as NATO is quote unquote fighting ISIS. The only time ISIS began to diminish was when the Russian government came in to help the Syrian government reestablish control as the Syrian government was about to fall. Iran, Hezbollah came in, and now we had so many parties acting in Syria. And so Syria at this point was essentially a failed state. Turkey colonized parts of it, the US was in parts of it, and it was just very fractured. And the sanctions, of course, were taking their toll on people, but still, the government continued to make sure healthcare was provided, free education was provided. I have my family members that studied in different fields, including medicine, up until Bashar fell. Of course, also, we have to talk about there was a lack of food. There was a massive devaluation of the currency, and people who were forced into fighting in the military that didn't want to fight in the military, power cuts, all sorts of issues crippling the country. And in large part, that's the sanctions, but also the massive foreign interference also of countries literally directly striking and bombing the country's infrastructure, whether it's Israel, whether it's Jordan, or you name it, Turkey. And so people, when they often say, oh, like Syria, Bashar killed 500,000 people, Bashar did kill a lot of people, but he did not. The 500,000 people is not just him. That's on NATO. If you look it up, Canada killed Syrian civilians. They killed Syrian civilians in Iraq as well, in their quote unquote fight against ISIS, which only grew under their bombardments. The US, a lot of these Western powers, and Turkey, and the Gulf states, and the groups that they all supported in Syria also killed a lot of civilians. So ultimately, the Syrian government is representative of its people, and other countries, such as also in powers like NATO, don't have a right to enter and to say which leader should lead or not lead a country. And this also goes for Libya. It is not NATO's role. NATO, quote unquote, claims to be a defensive military alliance. But is it a defensive military alliance to go and bombard a country in Africa that you disagreed with its policies? Do you think NATO used up its resources because they cared about the Libyan people? Of course not. They had their interests, and now Libya is destroyed. And similarly, Syria is in that boat. So, 2015 comes, Russia steps in, Syria gets its territories back. Not all of them, but a lot. It gets Aleppo and different parts. And Bashar reaches a point after a few years after that where he's at the most stable he's been in the civil war. A massive comeback. He was about to fall, his government, the Syrian government. And with Russian, Iranian support, it was restored. And it reached a point that the countries supporting the quote unquote rebel groups in Syria stopped working with the rebel groups and started to slowly get back to working with Bashar al Assad. We could talk about the United Arab Emirates, for example, Saudi Arabia inviting him, opening their arms to him, and other Arab leaders. And we were hearing talk of Turkey and stuff. But out of nowhere, soon you start to see in 2024, Iran met with Russia and Turkey, and you see this group coming out of Idlib, this militia that's like attacking Aleppo and quickly takes over Aleppo in a day or two. And the Syrian government is just retreating. And in under 2 weeks, the Syrian government fell. In under 2 weeks. You're telling me in 13 years, with NATO in the country and all of these forces, Bashar stood to all of that, and the Syrian government stood to all of that. And you're telling me they also killed 500,000 people. But they couldn't. In 2 weeks, they fell to this group that they put in Idlib. The Syrian government, if you remember, throughout the war, when they were going and retaking all these different villages and towns and cities, they would put all the fighters, they'd make deals with them, with their weapons, and send them to Idlib. These from different factions and groups, where it became a Turkish colony. It was led by these different groups, rebels, or whatever you want to call them, supported by Turkey, and they used Turkish currency, and Turkey was protecting it. Ultimately, in the end, this was a clear deal between the United States and Russia. Russia says, you give us Ukraine, we'll give you Syria. Because in the end, there's stakes for Israel in it, there's stakes for Turkey, and Iran has a stake in it as well. They will be protected and perhaps receive some sanctions relief, and until now, I'm confident that it will happen. Because in under 2 weeks, Russia pulled its embassy staff out of Syria. The Iranians followed Russia. This was while Bashar al-Assad was still in Damascus. And then Russia took its military equipment, not from Syria to Russia or Ukraine, it took it to Libya. Clearly, it wasn't doing this move because it needed more military support and maneuvering in Ukraine. It sent it from Syria to Libya. And Iran took its stuff and military and embassy staff out of Syria as well at the same time. And they decided together, we each have our interests in our deal with the United States and Turkey. And then, of course, Turkey's really happy because now they have their puppet who's not going to challenge Turkey's colonization of Syria. And so Jolani, who is a terrorist, who is a leader in Al-Qaeda, comes to Damascus, takes power. This guy had a $10 million bounty over his head by the United States as a designated terrorist, but suddenly he becomes a hero. He's aired on American news wearing Zelensky-type clothing, and people are very happy celebrating on December 8th, which I totally understand because you did have people who were imprisoned and murdered, including I have family members who were imprisoned and murdered at the hands of the Assad regime. But it doesn't mean I won't critically think about this whole situation and what's happening. Are we free? Is Syria free with this terrorist who came to take power, the removal of a government that brought a lot of policies and brought the most stability Syria had ever seen in many years, and made it a regional power that other countries had to pay attention to and show respect to?
The fact that I've been able to include Damascus in my first Middle East visit is a sign of the high importance that we attach to the views and policies of the Syrian government.
They try to persuade, to pressure, to mollify, but more often than not, they come away frustrated that Syria goes its own way.
A country that has now become a toy they all play with and just take its resources from. It's actually really sad. And like the lack of critical thought. So let's look at Jolani. Since he came to power, we have seen a massacre on the west coast of Syria of the Alawite minority, thousands killed, including entire families wiped off the earth. And we have seen Jolani immediately when he came to power install foreigners into high positions of power in the military, including Uyghurs, including Turkish people and Jordanians. And now we saw that Jolani has made certain commitments to Trump in order to get the sanctions removed. If you've been following the news just last week and recently, Trump has been saying that they're going to have to get a lot out of Syria for any sanctions to be removed. The US didn't want to remove sanctions. Maybe it would be willing to ease certain things, but not to lift all the sanctions. So Jolani had to really sweeten the deal. And it seems that what he did to sweeten the deal was a Ukraine, kind of what Trump wanted from Ukraine, but led to a fight with Zelensky in the Oval Office. But Jolani didn't want to fight. He wanted to give everything. He's willing to give US full access to Syria's oil, gas, natural resources, opening up to normalization with Israel, and even proposition of building a Trump Tower. Apparently, this is from Reuters news report. And so let's talk about the normalization. A lot of people say this is fake, this is just talk, you're making this up. The Damascus governor, as early as December, didn't even give it a month of being in power to start showing the government's true colors, went and made a crazy statement supporting peace with Israel. And then soon after, we had another official from the Free Syrian Army say that we would like to see Israel come and plant a rose in the Damascus gardens. And then more recently, we saw the Jolani government itself of Syria say that they had Syrian officials go and meet with Israeli officials in occupied Palestine. Not only that, but Israel, after December 8th, completely obliterated the Syrian military and until now has occupied parts of Syrian land beyond the occupied Golan Heights. And what has the Syrian government done about that? And by the way, this is a Syrian militia that apparently was so strong, it overwhelmed and took and destroyed the Syrian military within less than 2 weeks. It took over all of Bashar's forces and crippled them. But they can't dare respond to the Israeli aggression that have been encroaching on the Syrian capital. But apparently, Syria is free. I've been told that Palestinians should dream of having this kind of freedom. I wonder, did Jolani go and destroy the prisons that Bashar al-Assad or Hafez al-Assad built to torture people? Probably not. It probably already has people inside, new people to torture, who are now opposing this current government or maybe minority groups such as those they've been massacring on the West Coast. It hasn't even been half a year. Trust me, this government, we've been saying it from the beginning, they put someone, the US, who they were willing to pay $10 million if someone killed him. And now Trump meets with him and smiling and lifting sanctions. That comes at a very heavy price. The price is that this person standing there, if he dares do a word or a move against the West's interest in Syria, he's gone. They know where he is. But now he has to really work in line with them to maintain not only his power and seat, but his life. We saw what happens in Libya with Gaddafi and the situation of Libya today. We saw what happens around the Middle East. It's not to say that these are great leaders, whether it's Assad or Gaddafi. We shouldn't ever romanticize any human or put humans on a pedestal or in a godlike position, idealize them. But let's be critical. Maybe we shouldn't be idolizing Jolani. Maybe Jolani is indeed a Zionist puppet. And maybe we need to focus on liberating Palestine rather than supporting our normalizers. And how can he be happy that sanctions are being lifted at the price of the murder and starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, of normalizing relations with Israel and buying gas or selling gas or trade with this power that is oppressing your own people? Remember, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan are one. And soon, Syria is going to be fractured into more pieces. And are you going to start calling those different countries and telling people in one part of Syria to stay out of your part? It seems we have very short-term memory. Unfortunately, it seems there's very short-term memory. I don't see the future as being very bright for Syria, unfortunately. But in the end, I do see that the future is bright for the entirety of the region. But perhaps things need to get low. Do I find hope that people will one day wake up and realize what's happening and have critical thinking skills? No, because clearly you don't learn. No one seems to care to learn. There is a few minority that seem to understand, but it's too many people that put their selfish interests at the forefront. I've seen people say, "أنا مصلحة سوريا أول." Honestly, مصلحة Surya, first of all, this isn't for مصلحة Surya. Jolani is not helping Syria's interests. Also, as I said, Syria, despite being under sanctions, still provided free education and healthcare that's better than Canada and so many things. And it's not like millions were starving and dying of famine. And it shouldn't have to ever reach to that for just moves to be done to resolve the sanctions and the issues at hand. But it's just, it's mind-boggling to me. I hope people wake up, but this is my analysis of the situation. And I think moving forward, we see a puppet in Lebanon, a US puppet, unfortunately, and there's all these countries doing their own deals. Eventually, I'm going to talk next about this, but I do find that what Trump is doing is actually for the benefit of the Middle East's future and for the global South. And I think a lot of people in the global South are celebrating not his relief of sanctions on Syria, but from an accelerationist perspective, the fall of the imperialist global north, including NATO and these oppressive structures that have for too long targeted and harassed and killed communities in the global south. So that's something I want to discuss in more depth next time. And catch you later. Take care. This is Khaled Sasa for Pali Threads. Salam.